Good morning. This is David Mills from Russell Reynolds. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by both Gavin Patterson, the CEO of Salesforce International and on the board of BA, and also Rachel Empey, the CFO for Zenius, who's also on the board of Inchcape. And today we're going to be speaking about what we're referring to as the leadership curve that we've seen through the current crisis, and also, importantly, the pivot to progress. And over the last 4 weeks of the crisis that we've seen in Europe, in any case, we've obviously been speaking to a whole host of board members, CEOs, and their leadership teams on kind of how they've been managing through the crisis. So far, we've kind of seen the 4 weeks play out in a series of things. And in week one, I would qualify the conversations as being one driven by really a scramble to ensure business continuity and ensuring employee safety as were the really paramount focuses of these leaders. I think also in particularly the case of technology and health services, there's been a gigantic spike in demand. Now, I know this is not the case for all industries, but in the case of the technology and even like cloud computing, connectivity services such as Zoom, health services, they've seen triple, quadruple digit of growth and demand of need for help as we all change the way we work and live. Week two, you see leaders being much more clear on the business narrative in terms of the role that they play, both for their employees and also for the wider public, and particularly the enablement of government and health services at such a critical time. And then by week three, we began to see leaders talk about future potential, and that potential basically relating to a question about the way they run their companies, given the rapid changes in the way we're all communicating and working with each other, hence the YouTube style of interview going on with this panel as opposed to together in person with you. And at the same time, also the way within which they look at future opportunities in terms of pivot for opportunity for growth. And I guess at week four, which is where we are now, I think people are seeing overall much faster execution of their companies, and much more rapid deployment of technology in enabling those plans for execution. Tools such as AI and call centers dealing with increased customer demand. Tools such as AI and technology leading for tracking of activity around the virus growth or change. I think the other most important thing that I'd also add is that leaders, not surprisingly, are talking even more about purpose and the importance that purpose plays in leading through not only a crisis, but also about out of the crisis and where do the new phases of their companies go. So these are the themes that we've seen. I'm now going to turn to our panelists who've joined me today and to get their perspective on what they've seen and the things that are important to them as leaders, what they've observed in other leaders themselves around the world, and then also then moving towards where they begin to see opportunity for their own companies and also specific markets. Gavin.
So Gavin, we're delighted that you could join us this morning. And as you as CEO of International for Salesforce, as well as being on the board of BA, as well as being involved in a number of other investments in technology, I think you've got a very unique perspective of what's happening in the world and how different companies and different climates are dealing with the current crisis. Would love to, in the first instance, kind of get your reaction to some of the comments that I outlined as what we see leaders going through over the last 4 weeks in the current crisis, and to kind of get your view on what you see the leadership curve being over the past month.
Sure. Well, I think the way you describe it, David, is pretty consistent with what I've seen myself over the last few weeks. Undoubtedly, when it happened, there was a period of shock, and companies and individuals rallied to move their employees at home, manage business continuity, reduce costs quickly, that type of thing. And then pretty soon, I'd say companies fell into two groups after that. There are those that quickly organized their business, realized that business needed to go on, they needed to go forward, even saw opportunities emerging, particularly if they were over-indexed on digital and ahead of the curve on digital transformation. There are those that have realized that actually this is the beginning of the end, and
Yep.
They're desperately trying to find a way of creating a future. But if they haven't got a strong digital strategy, if they've been very focused on traditional business models, if you like, I think they've been struggling. I think that the final thing I'd say is we are, I think, beginning to enter a new phase now, potentially the third phase, which is the sort of new reality. And I think the scenarios for that are quite wide ranging. You know, on one hand, you know, will we be back in the office relatively quickly? Will we revert to a lot of the same behaviors as before? Probably not. I think this has been in some ways an incredible learning experience for people, that ultimately an awful lot more business and government and education can be delivered virtually and through online capabilities. So I don't see things reverting all the way back to the way they were, on one hand. On the other, I think it's clear now, certainly to me, that we're not going to be able to quickly get out of this.
Yeah.
You know, the vaccine, probably more than any of the other aspects of beating this virus, is the key thing. And until there's a vaccine, we'll be always managing a risk to some extent of putting people back in offices and back in factories. So I think in that respect, there will be a recovery, if you like, that is relatively slow and always has to be managed from a risk perspective. So in many ways, I think that's the same sort of curve that you described, leadership curve that you were describing in your opening.
And Gavin, when you kind of start thinking, you mentioned kind of future, and even once we have a vaccine and beyond and longer term, where do you think market opportunity sits for companies? And secondarily, what role do you think technology will play in that?
Well, from my perspective, I think this will accelerate digital transformation in every single business that I come across. Not those that are just set up to be digital first, but I think this has been a wake-up call for everybody's business, be that traditional retail through to education and even governance and government. Having a digital strategy that allows you to interact and maintain customer relationships through multiple different channels in different scenarios is, I think, fundamental to it. So what I see is that there are companies that are using this as an opportunity to get ahead. And while on one hand, some companies are clearly cutting back on investment, I see almost as many companies accelerating investment and bringing forward investment, particularly in digital transformation. And it is my sense that when we get through this, which I believe we will, there will be a different set of players at the table than the ones that we started the meal with, if you like. And those are the ones that have really used this as an opportunity to get ahead and build competitive advantage through digital.
And when you think about, Gavin, both your comments on what you've seen over the last 4 weeks, and then also kind of where you think the pivot or the puck will move and where there's opportunity, what are the leadership skills that you see kind of shining through now in the current crisis? And then what advice would you give people around the leadership skills required to take advantage of the opportunities that you outlined?
Well, it's interesting in your opening comments, you made a reference to this has been an opportunity to really see individuals' leadership skills in action. Sometimes in sort of normal times, if you like, you can't always get the best evidence to distinguish, who the best leaders are in your organization. But in times of crisis, it becomes crystal clear. And I have seen within the businesses I get to work with, true leadership come through from individuals. It's coping with the shock, quickly mobilizing and setting new direction for the business, creating a vision for the business, keeping people going. In times of crisis, these are the type of skills that have really shone through. You know, people need leaders to keep hope alive. You know? They need leaders to help them overcome obstacles and challenge some of the accepted norms that people thought were limitations on their behavior or their business or the way they educate themselves. And those are the leaders that have really shone through. They've sort of been able to set a new direction, break those norms, and keep hope alive during this situation. And it's been good. I think there's some extraordinary leadership that's really come through in this time.
And what role, lastly, Gavin, have you seen purpose play? Purpose could be seen as a luxury, but how much have you seen purpose being kind of critical to helping leaders through the current crisis?
I think it has been a time when purpose has become even more important. Now, at a basic level, business has to play a role in crisis, over and above simply making profit. I think we've seen plenty of opportunities across the board of business stepping up, making sacrifices, changing their business model to make important equipment to keep hospitals going and keeping people alive. But beyond that, in businesses, I think purpose is a way of rallying the organization behind a common goal, if you like, that is more than simply making money at a time like this. And so, the businesses that I work with, the ones that have a clear purpose, have quickly been able to corral their organization behind it, and feel as though they're doing something more than keeping their own business alive. They're actually keeping people's livelihoods going and making a much wider contribution to society. And I think it has been, if there was ever any doubt in people's minds of the importance of purpose, I think through this last few weeks, certainly in the businesses I've worked with, is that's been eradicated. It's been fundamental to keeping going.
So a combination of purpose-driven leadership and technology enablement will hopefully see both legacy companies and new companies through the current difficult period.
Yes, I think that's well put.
Gavin, thank you for your time today. Much appreciated.
Thanks, David.
So Rachel, first of all, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's great to have you here. Given this whole discussion is around not only the leadership in crisis, but also the pivot to progress, really, really keen to get your perspectives on a couple of key questions. And I think given your very unique vantage point of being a leader within one of the most notable health services companies in the world, plus also being on a UK board, as well as working in technology in the past, it would be great to kind of get your point of view on the kind of what I call the leadership curve that we've seen over the past couple of weeks.
Thanks, David, and really glad to be with you today. For me, to be honest, the first observation is we've all been on a personal journey over the last few weeks. I think unprecedented has had its biggest amount of usage in the last few weeks, but it is clearly a completely new situation for all of us. And each one of us has had to, if you like, understand and accept the situation and assimilate it, and then work out how to deploy and how to adapt the leadership that we need, and also the whole positioning of our business as part of that journey. And quite frankly, it's a journey that's gone, as you quite rightly described, somehow week by week, as we've assimilated the ever-changing situation and the potentially much broader consequences than we may have seen at the very beginning. And I think you've seen clearly everybody have a relatively urgent response at the beginning. And I think that's a natural leadership perspective to take. I need to do something. I've recognized that there's some really crucial things we need to do, and it's been a very urgent call to action. But for me, what's also been very crucial is the ability for leaders to step back once they're through that very urgent part of the curve, and really step back and see the broader perspective, the more strategic perspective, the implications for the different stakeholder groups in terms of not just customers, or in our case, patients, but also for employees, to set the broader setting of purpose to help orientate people in this very uncertain times, to give people a sense of of belonging and feeling of where they need to be, but also on the strategic side to really take that step back and say, what are going to be the broader implications, not for the next weeks, but for the next months and for the next years? Because clearly, for me, this is a leadership challenge that is a marathon and not a sprint, and one where we need to continue to adapt, but also have the foresight to really think about what the implications for our own business models and wider society might be.
And I guess we touched on moving from crisis to, I won't use the word opportunity, but I guess where the world moves also where you touched on a moment ago. Where do you think this moves, and in terms of where opportunity may exist internally or externally for companies such as yourself? And also within that, we've heard so much about technology. What role do you think technology plays in enabling that opportunity?
I mean, I think firstly that there's quite an obvious thing, if you like. Look at how we're doing this this discussion today. This the whole setting of the conference. From my perspective, the opportunity is for both businesses internally and externally to think about how they are managing in these unprecedented circumstances and to find some positives from that. I think we've all seen you can work digitally potentially much more effectively and efficiently than you ever thought. That the technology can facilitate very fast communication, global communication, fast decision making, and the combination of I would say, great data analytics, assimilation of significant rafts of data from different sources can very quickly facilitate a different kind of decision making and a different kind of communication than we've seen in the past. And that's, for me, the internal type opportunities and the technology enablers, if you like, that are coming out of this debate and this situation. But more broadly, to then say, and how does that pivot, to use your word, into what the implications might be in terms of the market positioning or the way that business models are going to adapt? Because we are going to see, and we are already seeing, significant changes in our own behavior, in how we are working, but also in how we are coping with this scenario. And although we clearly hope and are relatively clear we're not going to be in a complete lockdown for months and years, we are going to see an extended period of social distancing for sure. What is that going to mean in terms of how people change their behavior, and how can we facilitate, probably using and assisted by technology, to do things somewhat differently within our own business models? And I think what is born out of necessity can become an opportunity. And as we've seen in so many settings in the past, you can see very fast changes in personal behavior, both in the social sphere, but also in the work sphere. And those changes in behavior can have a massive acceleration effect in terms of the opportunity for business models, and particularly digital business models. And I think it's inevitable that we're going to see that coming out of this crisis.
Rachel, when you think about, I guess, a couple things around kind of your commentary on where we've been through so far with the crisis, and then secondarily where you discussed, call it the digital opportunity for companies, both externally and internally. What are the leadership skills that you see that have been really shining through in managing the current crisis to date? And I guess then you can keep using this expression about pivoting to where next, the leadership skills you think will be imperative for people watching the video, the guidance you give them on how you get your organizations and your teams to think about opportunity in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if we think about what we've seen in the past few weeks, for me, what has been very effective is, to be honest, what is effective in normal times, but it's just put into even sharper relief when you're in a crisis situation and where everybody is out of their comfort zone and is having to deal with a lot of uncertainty. For me, what is always effective is those leaders who are authentic, who have truly reflected on the situation, and in this circumstance acknowledged that they don't have all the answers, but that they can give orientation and purpose in terms of what are the next steps, what are the open questions that we need to address, and that they have that ability to get the right balance between urgent and something that we really need to address as part of this crisis now, but are taking that opportunity to step back and give their teams and give their leadership teams the perspective of where we might be headed and the questions that we need to address. And particularly for me, and I'm a huge fan of, my catchphrase almost is the power of teams. In this circumstance where none of us have seen the situation before, for me, what's particularly relevant is you need as many different perspectives and ways of thinking and ways of looking at the challenge as you possibly can. And that is where the power of teams, I think, is magnified even more greatly than in normal circumstances. And for me, what has been particularly effective from a leadership perspective is those who can be decisive and show leadership, but at the same time, have enough space to take a step back, to listen to others, to welcome in those different perspectives, to make sure that it is a balanced set of decisions that are being made with the urgent, but also the strategic and long-term orientated in mind. Clearly, everybody who's got different business models has had different sense of urgencies over the last couple of weeks. Some industries who are in complete lockdown clearly have had a very strong business continuity and liquidity protection prioritization. Some businesses, particularly in technology or in healthcare, where I'm working, have had to deal with managing potential disruptions to global distribution chains or global supply chains and a huge spike in demand. But at the same time, we've all had to deal with a change in personal circumstance, a change in how we manage our day-to-day lives. And the good leaders have been able to appreciate both sides of the metal, if you like, in terms of what's happened. I think a final comment from me on that would also be, for me, it's been a really interesting dichotomy, because we've seen a huge opportunity in terms of data flow, communication flow, digital exchange, as you mentioned, use of artificial intelligence. It's been a huge acceleration and awakening and an opening of the floodgates, if you like, in terms of digital communication and digital ways of doing business, often in segments or sectors that have not really been that open to those discussions in the past, let's say. But on the other side, the borders are closed pretty much. Physical movement is incredibly difficult, both for people, for goods, for international services. And that's a huge dichotomy that we're not used to. And I think that is also something that business leaders, and from a leadership perspective, you need to get your head around in appreciating personal implications for people of that situation, which is completely new, and how challenging that can be for people who are used to moving around in an international environment, or businesses that have supply chains that are truly globally set up and are currently very challenged. But at the same time, people are flourishing in a digital environment where they previously had very little experience. And for me, that dichotomy is also something that needs to be at the heart of leadership. That true leaders at the moment have really understood that, and understood the implications for their people and the psyche of their people and the purpose of their people, but also more broadly what it's going to mean for the strategic planning and setup of global supply chains or of communication chains, or whatever is important to somebody's business model, that they've truly understood and have taken that on board and have realized that this is a point in time. It is going to last for a while, but there are inevitably going to be long-term and permanent changes to behaviors and risk appetite as a result of this pandemic.
Really, really interesting, and you've kindly over the years helped on other thought leadership in the areas of diversity and inclusion. And what strikes me about what you're describing is, I'll use the word acceleration, rapid acceleration of themes that we've seen now being brought to the fore of those who win. So you touched considerably on purpose-driven leadership. I use the word transparency with kind of the leadership, through the leadership to the employee base. The other word you also talked about is drawing upon the broader perspective of people. And of course, what strikes me about that is also inclusion, and drawing upon being an inclusive, transparent, open leader with communicating with a sense of where the direction will go, but also being honest about the situation, drawing upon a broad set of views will probably help companies get there more quickly. And I think lastly, and again, this has been talked about so much, is around the rapid digitization of business models faster than we've seen before. So, Rachel, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great, and I'm sure the audience will really enjoy getting an opportunity to hear you, and I'm sure that we may end up having some subsequent questions.
Thanks, David.
Appreciate your time.